Well, there was death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state, because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work.
Well, first of all, let's be clear that it wasn't a Ukrainian famine. There was a famine all throughout the USSR. All right, the Soviet Union, they had defeated the foreign invaders. They had the new economic policy in the 1920s where they were empowering private farmers. And there was grain shortages and there was hunger. And so in a situation where you had grain shortages, a bad harvest, they sent in the military to create a collective farm system. And it was through the collectivization that you got tractors with which to run modern farms. And it was through the collectivization that you got the modern farming system, the first modern farming system in the history of Russia. Russia had never had mechanized agriculture before. They had, individual plots. They'd never had big, huge farms that could put out huge amounts of crops. And if you look at it, the collectivization was very difficult. And the famine that happened in the 1930s, early 1930s, was very horrendous. And you can argue that some of their policies, definitely contributed to the harshness of the famine. You can make that argument. But it was as a result of the collectivization that Russia got a modern agricultural system. Capitalism had been in Russia for quite some time, and under the Tsar, there had been mass starvation and famines routinely. People had been dying of, hunger every year. There was famines every year before the Bolshevik Revolution. People died of malnutrition in the Russian countryside all the time. And they were, operating their farms with horse-drawn plows. And they didn't have electricity. And they didn't have running water. And it's because of the Soviet Union and Stalin's 5-year economic plans that they got tractors to work their fields, that they got running water, they got electricity, they got modern apartment buildings to live in, not huts that they shared with their animals. I'm sorry, but if you look at the conditions in the Soviet countryside and you compare what they were before the revolution to what they were afterwards, it doesn't even compare. Running water, electricity, modern housing, literacy. The Bolsheviks wiped out illiteracy. And it was the Soviet Union that ended the famines, for Christ's sakes. These famines happened all the time before the Russian Revolution. People in the Russian countryside, people in the Ukrainian countryside, they all were starving to death all the time. And no one cared. It was just a fact of life. Well, that's what peasants do. They starve to death. If there's a crop failure, their landowner gets his share. And if there's not enough left over, you're fucked, guys. You starve. That was just how things were. And notice that there's no body count for that because that's just natural. That's just normal, right? That's not, we don't talk about, the Russian capitalism that was genocidal. We don't talk about feudalism as a genocidal system. Oh, no, that's just normal. But the Bolsheviks come to power. And through coming to power and breaking out of Western capitalism, they industrialize, they wipe out illiteracy, they electrify the country, they bring running water to the country, they almost double the life expectancy. And they mechanize agriculture, so they have a modern farming system, so they can, for the first time, actually feed the whole country. Huge achievements are happening, but none of that counts. But because there was a famine in the process, even though there were famines long before, even though the Bolsheviks are the ones that cured the famine, somehow that famine discredits the entire socialist project. I mean, that is what you call a selective interpretation of events. I'm sorry, what was the Soviet Union like before the Bolsheviks took over? And what was it like by the mid-30s after the first 5-year plan had been completed? I'm sorry, who electrified the entire country? Who wiped out illiteracy? I'm sorry, these facts, you can't just say, oh, there was a famine and that's the whole story. No. There were famines all the time. They cured the famines. That's the story. And that's why the whole world was marveling about what they were doing. Read what the New York Times had to say about them. Read what Albert Einstein had to say about them. Read what Time magazine. The whole world was having a Great Depression. And the Soviet Union was plowing ahead with rapid industrialization. They were raising people out of poverty. They built a modern educational system. None of this matters, right? It was just a big famine, But continue, Jordan, continue.
Slave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially.
So he's saying that the economy of the Soviet Union was run on gulags. you do realize there were less people by both numbers and percentage in the gulags than there are in American prisons right now. Now, is prison labor a part of the U.S. economy? Yes, it is. But do we have a prison economy? Would you say we have a slave labor economy? No, most people in the U.S. workforce are not in prison. And most people in the Soviet Union were not in prison, right? Were there gulags? Sure. And that's bad. And a lot of people who were in the gulags didn't belong there, according to even everyone's account. So I'm not going to defend the fact that there were people who shouldn't have been in those gulags who were put in them, right? And the Great Terror, Yezhovshchina, was a nightmare. And we don't deny that. No one's trying to say that conditions were good in the gulags. But I'm sorry, but by numbers and by percentage, the number of people in the gulags was far lower than the general population and far lower than prison population in the United States is even now. So you can't call it a slave economy. You can't call it that because, I'm sorry, the majority of the work in the factories, the majority of the work on the collective farms was not being done by prisoners. So that, I mean, just because they existed, just because there was prison labor in the Soviet Union does not mean the entire economy was based on that. I'm sorry, some things are true and some things are not. And if you're going to call that a slave economy, you better call the United States a slave economy, because at least in the Soviet Union, in those gulags, they were working for the state. They were working for the government. In the American prison system, you're working for Victoria's Secret. You're working for AT&T. You're working for private companies who get away with paying pennies an hour because they got an in with the government and they can use prison labor. They can pay you less than the minimum wage. If he wants to complain about prison labor and the use of prison labor, why is he not complaining about what's going on in the United States right now? Because it's a far bigger aspect of our economy than it was in the Soviet Union. Yes, gulags existed and people in those gulags did labor. That is true. But compared to what exists in the United States right now, the amount of prison labor in the U.S. economy is much bigger. It's much more of a factor. And it's for private companies that are enriching themselves and using the government to have slave labor. I mean, I'm sorry, these are facts here. So, if he's going to go about, it's a slave labor economy, American capitalism is far more of a slave labor economy by mere numbers and percentage. There are far more prison laborers, people in prison being forced to do work in the United States at this time than there were in the Soviet Union.
People, we don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And we won't get too picky about the numbers because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it.
You notice no one ever comes up with a body count like this for capitalism. The British created a man-made famine in Ireland that killed millions of people. In India, the British Empire with their free trade system killed millions of people in India. World War I, that happened just before the Russian Revolution, was 20 million people. 20 million people dying in a battle between the great imperialist powers, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, battling for carving up the developing world, right? So, that's 20 million right there in just a few years. You read about the Battle of the Somme, where it was like 100,000 people dying in a day. Let's do a body count for capitalism. How many people died in the colonization of Africa? How many people died in the transatlantic slave trade? How many people died? How many Native Americans were there when Columbus arrived compared to how many there are now? Right? Let's do the numbers. Let's do the math, right? There's never a body count like this, right? Every person who dies because they didn't have access to proper medical care should be added up into this body count for capitalism, right? The capitalist system began with slavery, with the killing of Native Americans. It began with the clearing of the commons, where they turned all the serfs and peasants into wage laborers and threw them off the land. They started executing vagrants. You could talk about the clearing of the Scottish Highlands. That was a genocide where the English went to the Scottish Highlands and cleared out all the Scottish people in the Scottish Highlands. That was a genocide. You can talk about all the ethnic conditions that people lived under. How many people died after working their lives in sweatshops, right? People from the countryside would go to the cities and be worked to death in mills and factories. How many people, how many young children worked in coal mines and breathed in the coal dust and died from that? I'm sorry, I want to hear, where's the huge numbers, right? Every single person who died in the Soviet Union of anything, their name gets added to this body count, right? So, why don't we do that for capitalism? If you did that for capitalism, the numbers would be so much higher. But none of that ever counts for capitalism. No, wars just happen. It's not capitalism's fault. Wars just happen. Oh, industrial accidents just happen. Oh, slavery. Well, that wasn't real capitalism. That was slavery. I mean, it's like, this is a ridiculous game that they play, right? And again, all the famines that happened in the Soviet Union are purely the fault of socialism, even though they cured famines, even though famines happen all the time before the revolution. They are the ones who built a modern agricultural system. They mechanized agriculture. They brought the tractors. But none of that counts. No. The famines count as if you actually killed somebody. This is ridiculous.